welcome. Are you ready for some spine-tingling scary stories tonight? In this video, we'll explore terrifying horror tales and paranormal mysteries that will leave you on edge. Before we dive in, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more creepy bedtime stories and eerie adventures every week. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know. Now sit back, relax to the sound of rain, and prepare yourself for a haunting story that starts in an attic filled with unsettling secrets. Story 1, The Text from the Shadows. Help me. Dot. The message flashed on my phone just as I was about to shut down for the night. I froze. The words seemed to crawl across the screen, sending a chill down my spine. For 3 long years, I had been searching for my brother Jake, who disappeared without a trace. Sleepless nights, endless investigations, and countless dead ends had left me hopeless. But now this message, this tiny spark of hope, had reignited something I had buried deep inside. And it came from the number I had never deleted, the one I kept as a reminder of him. With trembling hands, I typed back, "Jake, is it really you? Where are you?" Seconds stretched into what felt like hours as I waited for a response, the silence almost suffocating. The phone finally buzzed in my hand, jolting me out of my thoughts. "I'm in a basement. They won't let me go. Please hurry, Dot." My heart pounded. Jake was alive, but he was in danger. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and keys and rushed out the door. The streets blurred past as I sped to a place from our past, a diner we used to hang out at. Jake and I were inseparable growing up, and this diner was where we shared laughs over fries and milkshakes. But now, as I pulled into the parking lot, the familiar place seemed drenched in an ominous air. I pushed open the door, the bell jingling as the scent of old coffee and grease hit me. "Can I help you?" the waitress asked, her voice indifferent. "I'm looking for my brother, Jake. He used to come here. Have you seen him?" I asked desperately. She frowned, her eyes narrowing as she seemed to think. "Jake, can't say I remember, but you might want to try the bar down the street. He might have been there, Dot." With a quick thank you, I hurried back to my car and drove to the bar she mentioned. The place was dimly lit and filled with shadows that seemed to move in sync with the low, buzzing chatter. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room for any sign of Jake. I approached the bartender, my voice shaking with urgency. "I'm looking for my brother, Jake. He's been missing for years. Have you seen him?" The bartender wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze skeptical. "Can't say I have, but you might want to check the alley out back. Not everyone leaves through the front door, if you catch my drift, Dot." A cold knot formed in my stomach, but I had to follow this lead. I pushed through the crowded bar and into the narrow, dimly lit alley behind it. The air was thick with the scent of damp trash, and shadows stretched across the walls. "Jake?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, but it wasn't Jake. It was a girl, no older than 16, with wide, terrified eyes and dirt-streaked cheeks. She was shaking, her hands clutching her arms tightly. "Help me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They're keeping people in the basement. Please, you have to help Dot." My mind reeled, but I couldn't ignore the urgency in her voice. I had to find Jake, and this girl might be the key to where he was. "Where's the basement?" I asked, gripping her arm gently. She pointed across the street to a decaying, nearly forgotten building. "In there. But we have to move fast. They'll be back, Dot." Without another word, I took her hand, and we ran across the street toward the building. It loomed in front of us, dark and ominous, as if the very walls were keeping secrets. The door creaked open as we stepped inside. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper and dust-covered furniture. Every step echoed through the empty halls. We found the basement door at the end of the hallway. It groaned as it opened, revealing a staircase that descended into pitch blackness. My phone's light barely cut through the thick shadows as we moved down. The air grew colder, and the stench of mold and dampness filled my lungs. At the bottom of the stairs, I heard a faint, muffled cry. "Jake?" My voice cracked as I called out. A moment of silence, then a faint response. "Help. M.E. Dot." I rushed toward the sound, my heart racing. I stopped in front of a metal door, pounding on it. "Jake, I'm here. Hold on." The girl tugged at my sleeve, panic in her eyes. "We need to find the keys. They lock people up down here, Dot." We raced back upstairs, searching through the dust-covered drawers in a nearby office. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with fear. Finally, I found an old, rusty keyring beneath a pile of papers. I grabbed it and ran back to the basement, fumbling to find the right key. The door clicked open and I flung it wide. There, standing in front of me, was Jake, disheveled, pale but alive. Tears stung my eyes as I rushed to him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I thought I'd never see you again," he whispered, his voice weak and trembling. "You're safe now," I whispered back, holding him close. "We need to get out of here. Now, Dot." Together we raced back up the stairs, the girl's footsteps following close behind us. As we stepped out into the night, the oppressive air seemed to lift. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of despair lift from my chest. Jake was safe, and no one, nothing was going to take him away from me again. Story 2, the photograph of the lost girl. Cleaning out my late grandmother's attic was bittersweet. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of aged wood mixed with fading memories. I shifted through old boxes filled with trinkets, yellowed letters, and childhood toys, each one a small fragment of the life we once shared. My grandmother had been the rock of our family, a source of warmth, love, and endless wisdom. But now, all that remained were the objects she left behind. Amidst the clutter, I found something strange, an ornate box tucked away in the far corner, hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. Its intricate carvings immediately caught my attention. Curiosity tugged at me as I wiped away the dust and opened it. Inside, there were old photographs, faded snapshots of family gatherings and holidays, smiles frozen in time. But one photo, in particular, made my heart skip a beat. I pulled it out slowly, examining it carefully. The girl in the photo looked exactly like me, same dark hair, same dimpled smile, same eyes. But the date written on the back in my grandmother's handwriting sent a chill down my spine. 1997. The day I went missing, Dot. I sat down hard, my mind racing. How could this be? I was 5 years old when I disappeared for 3 long days. The memory of that time had always been a hazy blur, scattered fragments of fear and confusion. The frantic search parties, my parents' terrified faces. I barely remembered any details from those lost days. But now, this photo was in front of me. The girl who looked exactly like me was standing in a sunlit field, carefree and smiling. Who was she? How did my grandmother have this photo? I flipped the picture over again, looking closely at the handwriting. Found her playing near the old barn, it read. The old barn. The place where my grandmother always said she had spent her childhood. A place filled with stories of adventure and mystery. I hadn't been there in years, but something about the photo compelled me to go. I had to know what happened. The drive to the barn was short, but the weight of what I was about to uncover pressed down on me with every passing mile. When I arrived, the sight of the place struck me with a wave of nostalgia. The barn was weathered and worn, its wooden walls sagging under the weight of time. But it stood just as it had for decades. I stepped out of the car and walked cautiously toward the entrance. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the walls, casting dusty beams across the dirt floor. Everything looked the same, like it had been frozen in time. I could almost hear the echoes of my grandmother's stories, the laughter of long forgotten childhood adventures. I wandered around, hoping that anything would spark a memory. Then, I saw a patch of wildflowers growing just outside the barn, their colors bright and vibrant, swaying gently in the breeze. They were the same flowers from the photo. My heart pounded as I knelt beside them. Memories began flooding back, running through the field as a child, the warmth of the sun on my face, the sound of distant laughter. But there was something darker lurking in those memories. Shadows. I remembered seeing shadows moving in the distance. I remembered the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, a voice broke through my thoughts. "Can I help you?" I turned to see an older woman standing at the entrance of the barn. Her expression was a mix of concern and curiosity. "I found this photo," I stammered, holding it up for her to see. "This girl, she looks like me. I think it's from the day I went missing, Dot." Her eyes widened in recognition. "That was a long time ago. I remember when you disappeared. The whole town was looking for you, Dot." My heart raced. "But I don't remember much about that day," I admitted. "I think I've been here before, but the memories are so blurred, Dot." She stepped closer, her voice soft. "You might want to talk to my husband. He was the one who found you in the field and brought you back to your parents, Dot." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Your husband? He found me?" She nodded, gesturing toward a nearby house. "Come with me. He might be able to help you remember, Dot." We drove in silence, the weight of her revelation hanging in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to be uncovered. When we arrived at their house, I followed her inside, my mind racing with questions. Her husband was an elderly man, seated in a recliner. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, penetrating. As soon as he saw me, recognition flickered across his face. "I remember that day clearly," he said, his voice gravelly with age. "You were playing in the field, all alone. I found you standing there like you were lost but not scared, Dot." I leaned forward, desperate for more details. "How did I get there? What happened to me?" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You told me you were playing a game, but you didn't remember where you came from. You seemed confused, like you were in a trance, Dot." His words unlocked something deep inside me. I remembered now the shadows, the feeling of being watched. But more than that, I remembered a figure. A man standing in the distance, watching me. "Did I say anything about anyone else?" I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated. "You mentioned a man. You said he had been watching you, but you didn't know who he was, Dot." A cold chill crept over me as the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. The man, the shadows. I had buried the memories deep, but they were resurfacing now, and they terrified me. "Why didn't anyone talk about this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man's expression darkened. "Your parents were too scared. They didn't want to dwell on what might have happened. They were just grateful you were back, Dot." I nodded, trying to process everything. The girl in the photograph, the lost days, the figure watching me from the shadows, it was all connected. But what had really happened during those 3 days? And who was the man who had been watching me? As I left their home, I felt lighter but haunted. I still had so many questions, but at least now I had some answers. The photo had opened a door to my past, and I knew that to move forward, I would have to confront the shadows of my lost days. Story 3: The Girl on the Swing. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of day where the smell of fallen leaves and the sound of distant laughter filled the air. I decided to take a walk through the park, hoping to clear my head after a long, stressful week. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground as I strolled along the path. As I walked, I noticed a little girl sitting alone on a swing, her head bowed and her hands idly twirling the wood chips beneath her feet. There was something off about her, detached from the happiness that seemed to surround the park. I approached cautiously. "Hey there," I said softly, crouching down to her level. "Are you okay?" She looked up at me, her big brown eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can't find my mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. My heart sank. "Where did you last see her?" The girl pointed toward the playground. "Over there by the slide dot." I looked in the direction she indicated but didn't see anyone who looked panicked or concerned. I held out my hand. "Come on, let's go find her together, Dot." She took my hand without hesitation, her grip small and fragile, and we walked toward the playground. I scanned the area, looking for anyone who might be searching for a missing child. "Excuse me," I called out to a group of parents nearby. "Is anyone missing a little girl?" They glanced around, confused, but no one claimed her. I felt a twinge of anxiety. The little girl tightened her grip on my hand as we approached the slide. "Mommy," she cried out, her voice breaking with desperation. I turned, expecting to see a relieved mother rushing over. Instead, a woman stepped forward with a pale face, her eyes wide with shock. "Is this your daughter?" I asked, relieved that we'd found her. But the woman shook her head, her voice trembling. "No, I don't know her. I thought she was lost, too, Dot." Confusion washed over me. "What do you mean?" She said she couldn't find her mom, Dot. The woman stepped closer, her expression filled with dread. "My daughter's at home. She hasn't been to this park today, Dot." I looked down at the little girl, now staring at the ground, her expression unreadable. "What's your name, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Emma," she replied softly, still avoiding eye contact. A chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. "Emma, do you know where your mom is?" She shook her head, her earlier confidence slipping away. I turned to the woman, whose face had turned ashen. Before I could ask another question, a park ranger approached us, concern etched into his features. "Is everything all right here?" The woman spoke first. "She's not my daughter," she explained, gesturing to Emma. "I don't know who she is. Dot." The ranger frowned, turning to me. "Where did you find her?" I pointed back to the swing set. She was sitting by herself. "I thought she was lost, Dot." His expression darkened. "That's strange. I've been patrolling this area all day, and I haven't seen a little girl alone, Dot." My heart began to race as the pieces didn't seem to add up. I looked back at Emma, who stood frozen next to me, her small body trembling. "Emma," I said gently, trying to reassure her, "do you know where you came from?" She shook her head again, her eyes welling with tears. The ranger pulled out his phone, probably to call for backup. The atmosphere grew tense, the confusion thickening as none of us could understand what was happening. How could a child just appear and have no one looking for her? I knelt down beside her. Emma, do you know how you got here? For a moment she stayed silent, her lips quivering. Finally she whispered, I don't know. I just wanted to play Dot. A deep sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The ranger was now on the phone with someone, talking in hushed tones. The woman who had initially come forward was staring at Emma, her expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. Minutes passed in uncomfortable silence until another woman arrived, breathless and flushed with panic. What's going on? She asked, looking at all of us, her eyes full of confusion. The ranger stepped forward. Do you know this little girl? He asked, pointing to Emma. The woman looked at Emma, then back at us, shaking her head. No, I don't. But I'm supposed to meet my daughter here soon, Dot. The situation felt more bizarre with every passing second. Emma stood between us, a small, quiet figure amidst the chaos. The ranger knelt down to Emma's level, speaking softly. Can you tell us where you live, Emma? Maybe your address? She shook her head again, tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't remember Dot. I felt my heart ache for her. Something was deeply wrong, and I didn't know how to help. The ranger glanced at me, and I could see the unease in his eyes. We're going to need to bring her to the station, he said quietly. We have to figure out who she is and where she belongs, Dot. We started walking toward the park office. The tension was thick, and I could feel Emma's small hand trembling in mine as we moved forward. The park, once filled with laughter and joy, now felt eerily quiet, as if the trees themselves were watching us. Inside the office, another ranger met us and started taking notes. What's the situation? He asked, looking over at Emma. She claims she's lost, but no one here recognizes her, the first ranger explained. The second ranger knelt down next to Emma. What's your name again, sweetheart? Emma, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Do you remember anything about your home? Your parents? He asked, his voice gentle. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Then, the door swung open and a woman rushed in. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale with panic. I'm looking for my daughter, she cried, her voice thick with desperation. The ranger stepped forward, a wave of relief washing over his face. Is your daughter named Emma? The woman's eyes widened, her face flooded with emotion. Yes, where is she? I turned to look at the little girl at my side, but something was wrong. Emma didn't move. She didn't look at the woman. She just stood there, staring at the ground, her expression unreadable. The woman rushed over, pulling Emma into a tight embrace. Oh, sweetheart, I've been so worried. I thought I'd lost you. But Emma didn't react. She let the woman hug her, but she remained completely still, as if she wasn't even there. As I watched them, a strange thought crept into my mind, sending a chill down my spine. Was Emma really lost? Or had she been waiting for something else all along? Story 4, The Whispering Mirror. When we moved into the old house, I didn't think much of the strange things people said about it. My family had always wanted to live somewhere quiet, a place where we could slow down and breathe. So when we found a large, old house in the countryside for a steal, it seemed perfect. The fact that it had stood empty for years didn't bother us much. The house was beautiful, even if it needed some repairs. It had high ceilings, wide windows, and a huge garden where my younger sister, Lily, loved to play. But there was something about it, something that made me uneasy, even from the first day. It wasn't the creaking floors or the drafts that sent shivers down my spine. It was the mirror. In the upstairs hallway, at the end of a long, dark corridor, hung an old, oval-shaped mirror. It was large and ornate, the kind you'd expect to see in a Victorian mansion. Its frame was intricately carved with strange patterns, almost like faces trapped within the wood. From the moment I laid eyes on it, I felt unsettled. At first, I tried to ignore the feeling. I told myself it was just my imagination, that moving into a new place always takes some getting used to. But something was wrong with that mirror. It didn't reflect things the way it should. It started small at first. I noticed little things, like how the mirror seemed to hold onto your reflection for just a second too long after you walked away. I would catch glimpses of myself out of the corner of my eye, even when I wasn't standing in front of it. One night, as I was passing by the hallway, I glanced at the mirror out of habit. The hallway behind me was dimly lit, but in the mirror, the reflection showed something else. The hallway seemed darker, almost shrouded in shadows, and for a split second, I thought I saw a movement, a shadow darting across the glass, vanishing before I could make sense of it. I stopped, turning around to check the hallway behind me, but it was empty. I stared at the mirror again, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light. "It's just your mind playing games," I whispered to myself, backing away. But that night I had a strange dream. I was standing in front of the mirror, but the reflection staring back wasn't mine. It was someone else, someone who looked like me, but wasn't me. She had my face, my eyes, my hair, but her smile was too wide, her eyes too dark, and she was whispering something I couldn't understand. I woke up drenched in sweat. The image of that twisted smile burned into my mind. Things got worse from there. My sister, Lily, started talking about the mirror too. One afternoon, I found her sitting in front of it, her little face pale as she stared at her reflection. "Lily, what are you doing?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She didn't answer for a moment, just kept staring at the glass. Finally, she whispered, "She's talking to M.E. Dot." A chill ran down my spine. "Who's talking to you?" Lily turned to me, her eyes wide and frightened. "The girl in the mirror. She says she wants to come out, Dot." My stomach twisted. "Lily, stop it. It's just a mirror, Dot." But she shook her head. "No, she's real. She told me her name is Evelyn, and she's stuck in there, Dot." I didn't know what to say. I took her by the hand and pulled her away from the mirror, telling her not to play there anymore. But the damage was already done. That night, the whispering started. I was lying in bed, the house quiet, when I heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper, like someone was speaking just beyond the door. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. "Let me out, Dot, Dot, Dot." The words were faint but unmistakable. I bolted out of bed and rushed to the hallway. The whispering grew louder as I approached the mirror. "Let me out. Please, Dot, Dot, Dot." My hands trembled as I reached for the mirror, feeling the cold surface beneath my fingertips. The whispering stopped. I stood there, staring at my reflection, waiting for anything to happen. Suddenly, my reflection began to shift. My face twisted into a grotesque smile, and the eyes staring back at me were not mine. They were dark, empty, filled with malice. The whispering returned, louder now, and I could finally make out the words. You can help me. Let me out, Dot. I stumbled back, heart racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. My reflection, no, Evelyn was smiling, her hands pressed against the glass as if she were trying to break through. Let me out, Dot, 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 she pleaded again, her voice more insistent. I shook my head, backing away from the mirror. No, I can't, Dot, Dot, Dot. The reflection's smile faded, replaced by a look of anger, then fury. The mirror shook violently, and I could hear the sound of glass cracking. I ran. The next morning, I told my parents everything. They listened, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They thought I was imagining things, that maybe the stress of the move had gotten to me. But Lily backed me up, telling them about Evelyn, the girl in the mirror who spoke to her. My parents decided it was best to take the mirror down, at least for our peace of mind. My dad pulled it off the wall and placed it in the attic, covering it with a heavy cloth. But even after the mirror was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn was still watching. For weeks after, I avoided the attic. The house felt quieter, but the memory of that twisted reflection haunted me. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, Evelyn had been real. But then, one day, while I was home alone, I heard it again, the faint whispering. Let me out, Dot, Dot, Dot. I froze, staring up at the ceiling, where the attic was. I knew then that Evelyn was still there, waiting. Story 5, the house that called my name. It had been years since I last visited the small town where I grew up. Life had pulled me away, and I hadn't thought much about it until I received the letter. It was from my aunt, Martha, informing me that the house I grew up in had been abandoned after my parents passed away. She said it had been sitting empty, waiting for someone to claim it. The letter brought back a flood of memories, good ones, but also those that were dark and unsettling. That house had always felt like a place of secrets, the place where shadows seemed to move just beyond the edge of your vision. As a child, I had vivid nightmares about the house, but those fears faded as I grew older and moved away. Now, with my parents gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was calling me back. I decided to return to the town and see the house for myself. Driving through the familiar roads, I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and unease. The closer I got to the house, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if something was waiting for me. When I finally arrived, the sight of the house sent a shiver down my spine. It hadn't changed at all. The same crooked shutters, the same weathered front porch, even the same eerie silence that hung in the air. But there was something different about it now, a sense of abandonment, like the house had been forgotten by time itself. I parked the car and stood in front of the house for a moment, taking it all in. Then, with a deep breath, I made my way to the front door. It creaked open easily, the sound echoing through the empty hallways. Stepping inside felt like stepping into a memory. The familiar scent of old wood and dust filled my lungs as I walked through the house. Everything was as it had been, furniture draped in white sheets, paintings hanging crooked on the walls, and the grandfather clock in the corner that hadn't worked in decades. As I walked through the house, I felt an odd sensation, as if the walls themselves were watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I told myself it was just nerves. I made my way to the living room, where the large bay window looked out onto the overgrown garden. I stood there for a while, lost in thought, when I heard it. Liam ... I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned around, scanning the empty room. The voice had been faint, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Someone had called my name. But the house was empty. I was alone. I swallowed hard and told myself it was just the wind, or maybe my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. That voice had sounded too real, too familiar. I decided to check the rest of the house. Maybe someone was inside. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. I moved cautiously down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The house felt colder now, as if a chill had settled into the very walls. I reached the staircase and began to climb, the wooden steps creaking beneath my weight. At the top of the stairs was the door to my old bedroom. I hesitated for a moment before reaching for the doorknob, my hand trembling slightly. When I pushed the door open, I was hit with a rush of cold air. The room was just as I had left it, my old bed, the faded wallpaper, the bookshelf filled with dusty books I hadn't touched in years. But there was something else, something new. In the corner of the room stood a mirror I didn't recognize. It was tall and old, the frame made of dark wood that was intricately carved with strange, twisting designs. I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I stared at my reflection, but something was off. My face looked different, pale, almost ghostly. In my eyes, there was something in my eyes that I couldn't place, something dark and hollow. Suddenly, the voice came again. Liam ... This time it was louder, clearer, like someone was standing right behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I backed away from the mirror, my heart racing. I hurried out of the room, down the stairs, and back into the living room, but the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. I could feel eyes on me unseen, but there. The house felt alive, and it didn't want me to leave. I tried to calm myself down, convincing myself that it was just the memories of this place getting to me. But then the door slammed shut behind me, and the house went completely silent. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. I needed to get out, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the house itself had rooted me in place. And then I saw her. Standing in the doorway, just barely visible in the dim light, was a woman. Her face was shrouded in shadow, but her eyes, they were cold, dark, and fixed on me. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her hair long and tangled, and she didn't move. She just stared. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to respond. I was trapped, frozen in place as the woman slowly stepped toward me, her eyes never leaving mine. Liam ... she whispered, her voice low and haunting. I don't remember how I got out of the house. The next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for air, the front door slamming shut behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran to my car and sped away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the house just a distant memory in the rearview mirror. But even now I can still hear her voice calling my name. And I know deep down that one day the house will call me back. Story 6, The Figures in the Fog. The fog rolled in thick and heavy that night, blanketing the town in a cold, eerie mist. I had never seen anything like it before, so dense that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. It was unsettling, especially on a night when I had to walk home from work. I zipped up my jacket and stepped out of the small cafe where I worked, pulling my hood over my head as I began the slow trek home. The streets were unusually quiet, the typical buzz of late-night city life muted by the fog. My footsteps echoed unnervingly against the damp pavement. The fog seemed to swallow everything, distorting shapes and sounds. It was disorienting, making me feel like I was walking in circles even though I knew the way home by heart. As I made my way through the deserted streets, I started to feel uneasy. Something wasn't right. The fog wasn't just thick, it felt wrong, almost alive, as if it were watching me. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a figure appeared, just barely visible through the fog. It was tall and motionless, standing at the edge of the sidewalk, shrouded in the mist. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I squinted, trying to make out its features, but it was too far, too cloaked in the fog to see clearly. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The figure remained still, almost statue-like, its presence unnerving. I swallowed hard and decided to keep moving, walking faster now. As I passed the spot where the figure stood, I glanced back over my shoulder. It was gone. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a trick of the fog, an illusion. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The fog felt thicker now, closing in around me like a blanket of cold, wet air. I could barely see a few feet ahead. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, my heart racing. Slowly, I turned around. Another figure stood in the fog, closer this time. It wasn't moving, but it was there, tall, looming, its features hidden in the mist. My throat went dry as fear tightened its grip on me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. I took a step back, my breath coming in short gasps. Something was very wrong. The fog felt suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. Without thinking, I turned and ran. The fog swallowed me as I sprinted down the street, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from whatever that was. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps followed. They were slow and deliberate, but they never stopped, echoing through the fog, growing louder with every step. I glanced back, panic rising in my chest. There was another figure, even closer now. I stumbled, nearly tripping over my own feet, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but the fear driving me forward was stronger than the pain. The fog seemed endless, the street stretching out before me like a nightmare that wouldn't end. I couldn't see anything, just the thick, white mist and the dark figures that seemed to multiply behind me. I turned a corner, hoping to lose whatever was following me, but as I did, I stopped dead in my tracks. Ahead of me, barely visible through the fog, stood another figure. This one was different. It was hunched over, its limbs long and twisted, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It looked like a grotesque shadow, barely human. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure in front of me didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. Then, out of the silence, I heard a low, guttural whisper. "Come closer, ... The voice seemed to come from the fog itself, wrapping around me like a cold hand. I shook my head, backing away. "Come closer ... the voice repeated, more insistent now. I turned to run, but the fog was everywhere. The figures were everywhere. No matter which way I looked, they stood there, watching, waiting, their dark shapes barely distinguishable from the mist. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I didn't know where to go, didn't know how to escape. The fog was too thick, too disorienting. Finally, I spotted a streetlight in the distance, its faint glow barely cutting through the fog. I ran toward it, hoping it would offer some kind of refuge, some kind of clarity. As I reached the light, I stopped beneath it, panting and gasping for air. The fog swirled around me, but under the light, it seemed less oppressive. I looked around, scanning the streets. The figures were gone. The footsteps had stopped. The whispers had faded into silence. It was as if the fog had swallowed them whole, leaving nothing but the empty streets behind. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart still racing, my body trembling. The fog hung in the air, thick and heavy, but the figures, the ones that had been chasing me, had disappeared. I didn't know what had just happened, didn't know if I had imagined the whole thing, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I ran the rest of the way home without looking back, the eerie silence of the fog lingering in my mind. Even now, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I stay inside, because I know they're still out there, hidden in the mist, watching and waiting for someone else to come too close. Story 7, The Shadow Under the Bed. When I was a kid, I had an intense fear of the dark. Every night, I would beg my parents to leave the hallway light on, just enough to keep the shadows from creeping into my room. But no matter how many lights were left on, there was always one place that terrified me more than anything else: the space under my bed. It wasn't just an ordinary childhood fear. There was something different about it. I could never shake the feeling that something was down there, watching me from the shadows. I would lie awake at night, my heart pounding, too scared to dangle a foot off the side of the bed, terrified that something might grab me. My mom always reassured me it was just my imagination. "There's nothing under your bed, honey," she'd say, tucking me in and kissing my forehead. "You're safe, Dot." But I never felt safe. It started when I was about 8 years old. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard a faint noise, a soft shuffling sound, like something moving under the bed. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a few moments I listened, hoping it was just the house settling or the wind outside. But then I heard it again, a deliberate, quiet scraping noise, like something was shifting beneath me. I pulled the covers tighter around myself, too afraid to move. My heart raced as I strained to hear, every muscle in my body tense. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, trying to calm down. "It's just your imagination, Dot." But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like whatever was under the bed was trying to get out. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the blanket over my head, praying that it would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. Silence filled the room, but I didn't move. I stayed there, huddled under the blankets, until I finally drifted off to sleep. The next morning I tried to forget about it. I told myself it had just been a bad dream. But as the days went on, the noises continued. Every night, the soft shuffling sound would return. Sometimes it was so faint I could almost convince myself it wasn't real. But other times, it was loud enough that I was sure something was moving under my bed. I told my mom about it, but she just smiled and said, "It's just your imagination. There's nothing under there." She even lifted the blankets to check, showing me the empty space beneath the bed. But I knew better. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was making the noise. As I lay in bed, the shuffling started again. My heart pounded and my hands shook as I slowly leaned over the edge of the bed, clutching the blanket in one hand. The air was thick with tension as I lowered my head, peeking over the side. For a moment, I didn't see anything, just darkness. But then, in the faint light from the hallway, I saw it. A pair of eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. I gasped, pulling back and scrambling to the other side of the bed. My heart raced, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The eyes disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, but I knew they had been there. Something was under my bed. I wanted to scream, to call for my parents, but my voice caught in my throat. I didn't want whatever was under the bed to know I'd seen it. I sat there, frozen in fear, until exhaustion eventually took over, and I fell asleep. The next day, I tried to convince myself it hadn't been real, but I couldn't shake the image of those eyes, watching me from the darkness. I started avoiding my bedroom, making excuses to stay up late or sleep on the couch. My parents didn't understand. They thought I was just being difficult. But I knew the truth. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get rid of whatever was under my bed. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and marched up to my room, determined to face my fear once and for all. As soon as I entered the room, I felt the oppressive weight of something watching me. The air was thick, almost suffocating, but I ignored it. I had to do this. I stood at the edge of the bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and knelt down slowly. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I clicked it on, shining the beam into the darkness beneath the bed. At first, I didn't see anything, just the usual clutter of old toys and forgotten clothes. But then, in the far corner, something shifted. The beam of the flashlight flickered as I tried to focus on the movement. I leaned in closer, squinting into the darkness. That's when I saw it. A hand. Thin, pale, and covered in dirt, the hand was curled into a fist, as if it had been reaching for something. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stared, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The hand twitched. I scrambled back, dropping the flashlight as I fell to the floor. My heart pounded in my ears, and a wave of nausea washed over me. The room spun as I scrambled to my feet, desperate to get out. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My parents found me sitting at the top of the stairs, shaking and unable to speak. After that night, I refused to sleep in my room. My parents, concerned but still unconvinced, finally decided to move my bed and clean out the space underneath. They found nothing, of course, just some old boxes and forgotten toys. But I knew what I had seen. We moved a few months later, and I never had to go back to that room. But even now, as an adult, I still can't sleep with my bed against the wall. I keep it in the center of the room, and I never, ever let my hand dangle over the edge. Because I know deep down that something is still there, waiting. Story 8, The Silent Watcher. I'd never believed in ghosts or spirits. To me, they were just stories meant to scare kids or entertain people with overactive imaginations. But all that changed the night I moved into my new apartment. The building was old, but the rent was cheap, and as a college student, I couldn't be picky. It was a quiet place, tucked away on a narrow street with hardly any foot traffic. The landlord mentioned that the previous tenant had left in a hurry, but I didn't think much of it. People move all the time. My first few days there were uneventful unpacking, settling in, and getting used to the creaks and groans of an old building. But on the fourth night, things started to feel different. It was subtle at first. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. It didn't bother me much, though. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me as I adjusted to the new place. But then, the feeling started. The feeling that I wasn't alone. It always happened at night. I'd be sitting in the living room, watching TV or studying, and suddenly I'd get this overwhelming sensation that someone was watching me. It was unnerving, like a pair of eyes was fixed on me from somewhere in the room. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was just paranoia, that it was normal to feel uneasy in a new place. But the feeling grew stronger each night, more intense, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, as I sat on the couch, that sensation returned, stronger than ever. I glanced around the room, my heart starting to race. The apartment was small, just a living room, a kitchenette, and a bedroom, so it wasn't hard to scan the entire space in a few seconds. But I didn't see anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, lurking just beyond my sight. That's when I noticed it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow in the hallway. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there, a dark figure standing just outside my bedroom door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared at the hallway, willing myself to believe that it was just a trick of the light, that my mind was playing games. But the shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I barely slept that night, too afraid to close my eyes. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that it had to be a shadow cast by something outside, or maybe a reflection from the streetlight. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next night, the same thing happened. I was sitting in the living room when that oppressive feeling of being watched settled over me like a heavy blanket. I looked toward the hallway, and there it was again, a shadowy figure standing in the same spot, just outside my bedroom. This time I didn't look away. I kept my eyes fixed on the shadow, refusing to blink, refusing to let it disappear. But the longer I stared, the more real it seemed. I could almost make out the shape of a person, a tall, thin figure, standing perfectly still. And then slowly the figure started to move. It stepped forward just a few inches, but enough to make my blood run cold. I scrambled off the couch, backing away toward the front door, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move again, it just stood there, half hidden in the shadows, as if waiting for me to do something. I didn't stick around to find out what. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment, not stopping until I was outside on the street, gasping for breath. I looked up at the windows of my apartment, half expecting to see something peering down at me. But there was nothing. I stayed with a friend that night, too scared to go back to the apartment. I told her what had happened, but she just laughed it off, saying I'd been watching too many horror movies. but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The next day, I returned to the apartment, hoping the daylight would make everything feel normal again. And for a while it did. I cleaned, went about my day, and tried to convince myself that I'd overreacted. But as soon as the sun began to set, the unease crept back in. By the time night fell, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag, intending to leave and stay with my friend again. But as I stood in the living room, zipping up my bag, I heard it a soft, barely audible sound. A whisper. It was so faint that I almost didn't hear it, but it was there. My breath hitched as I turned toward the hallway. Leave, ... The word was whispered, almost like a breath carried on the air. I froze, my entire body trembling. I didn't wait to hear it again. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door. I never went back to that apartment. I called the landlord the next day and told him I was breaking the lease. When he asked why, I didn't know how to explain it. I just said I wasn't comfortable there. A few weeks later, I found out why the previous tenant had left so suddenly. The landlord let it slip during a conversation. The man who had lived there before me had complained about the same thing, feeling watched, hearing whispers at night. He'd even seen the shadowy figure standing in the hallway. But the worst part, he'd claimed the figure wasn't just watching him. It was waiting for him to fall asleep. Story 9: The lake that swallowed them. The lake was always quiet in the early mornings. The mist would hover just above the still water, making it look like the world ended at the horizon. It was peaceful, too peaceful, some might say. My friends and I used to come out to the lake every summer, spending our days swimming and fishing, and our nights telling ghost stories around the campfire. But that was before the summer of 2005, the summer when everything changed. It was supposed to be like any other trip, just a few of us, a weekend of fun by the lake. Mark, Sarah, Alex, and I had packed our bags and headed out to our favorite spot, the secluded little cove at the far end of the lake. No one ever went there, which made it feel like our own private paradise. The first day was perfect. We swam, cooked hot dogs over the fire, and laughed until our sides hurt. As night fell, we sat around the fire, trading the same old stories we'd been telling for years. But then, Mark brought up something new. "Did you guys ever hear about the lake legend?" he asked, poking the fire with a stick. Sarah rolled her eyes. "Come on, Mark, we've heard every ghost story about this place, ... Mark shook his head. "Not this one. It's not the typical haunted woods story. This one's different, ... Alex leaned in, intrigued. "All right, let's hear it, ... Mark glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening, and lowered his voice. "There's a story that the lake takes people, ... We all looked at him, waiting for more. "There's this old tale that says people have disappeared around here for years, pulled into the water. No bodies, no traces, nothing. Just gone. And they say that if you're by the lake late at night, you can hear them calling for help, ... A chill ran down my spine, and I laughed it off nervously. "Sure, Mark. That's totally believable, ... But Mark wasn't smiling. "I'm serious. My grandfather used to tell me that when he was a kid, he saw someone vanish right in front of him. They were swimming, and then they were just gone, ... We all fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the stillness of the night. The next day, we joked about Mark's story, but there was an undercurrent of unease that we couldn't shake. We swam less and spent more time on the shore, avoiding the deeper parts of the lake. That night, after another campfire, we all turned in for bed. The others fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring up at the stars, when I heard a faint sound, like someone whispering my name. I sat up, straining to listen. "Jack ... The voice was soft, carried on the wind, barely audible over the rustling of the trees. I glanced around, but everyone else was asleep. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the campsite. "Jack ... I froze. It was coming from the lake. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. The voice was clearer now, still soft but unmistakable. Someone was calling me from the water. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the edge of the lake, the beam cutting through the mist that had settled over the water. The lake was calm, the surface smooth like glass. But there was something in the middle of the water, a shape, barely visible through the fog. It looked like a person. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, my feet sinking into the wet sand at the edge of the water. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The shape didn't move. It just floated there, half submerged in the water, staring at me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. The next thing I remember is Sarah shaking me awake. I was lying on the sand, my flashlight still clutched in my hand. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the lake. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Sarah asked, her voice full of concern. I sat up, dazed and confused. I don't know," I muttered. "I heard something. Someone calling me. Sarah frowned. "You were sleepwalking, Jack. You scared the hell out of me. I found you lying right at the water's edge. I blinked, trying to make sense of what had happened. It felt like a dream, vivid but unreal. But the dampness on my clothes and the sand clinging to my skin told me otherwise. I wasn't sure what to say. I hadn't been sleepwalking. I knew I hadn't. I'd heard something calling me from the lake. The rest of the day passed in a tense, uneasy silence. No one mentioned what had happened the night before, but I could tell everyone felt it, the growing sense of dread that hung over us like a storm cloud. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the lake, staring at me from the mist. I tossed and turned, trying to shake the image from my mind, but it wouldn't go away. Then I heard it again. Jack ... The voice was clearer this time, more insistent. I bolted upright, my heart racing. The others were still asleep, unaware of the voice calling my name. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the tent, my hands trembling. I didn't want to go back to the lake, but something was pulling me toward it, something I couldn't explain. I reached the shore, and there it was again. The figure, floating in the middle of the lake, barely visible through the mist. But this time it wasn't alone. There were others. Shapes, dark and indistinct, bobbed on the surface of the water. I counted 5, no, 6 figures, all floating silently in the mist, their eyes fixed on me. "Jack, come closer ... the voice whispered. I took a step back, fear gripping my chest. "What do you want?" I called, my voice shaking. "Come closer ... the voice repeated. I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the water itself was pulling me in, dragging me toward the figures that waited in the mist. I stumbled, falling to my knees in the sand, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figures, slowly rising out of the water, their faces pale and hollow. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. The park ranger had found me on the shore, unconscious and barely breathing. They said I was lucky to be alive. But my friends Mark, Sarah, and Alex, they were gone. The authorities said they had drowned, pulled under by strong currents. But I knew better. The lake had taken them. And it was still calling for me. Story 10, The Man in the Window. When I was a kid, my room faced the street. I had a small window right above my bed, and on summer nights, I used to keep it open to let the cool air in. From my bed, I could see into the neighbors' houses, the streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalks, and occasionally the flicker of passing cars. But there was one house across the street that always gave me an uneasy feeling. It was old and run down, the paint peeling off the siding, the windows covered with grime. No one ever seemed to go in or out, and I'd never seen anyone living there. It was just abandoned, or so I thought. One night I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The soft breeze from the open window rustled my curtains, and the street was unusually quiet. I rolled over, glancing out the window, and that's when I saw him. In the window of the old house, standing perfectly still, was a man. He was tall, with dark hair and pale skin, and he was staring directly at me. His face was blank, expressionless, but his eyes, they were wide and dark, almost unnaturally so. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me from across the street. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, that maybe I was imagining things. But when I looked again, he was still there, watching me from that grimy window. My heart pounded in my chest as I yanked the curtains closed, shutting out the eerie sight. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I peeked through the curtains, half expecting to see the man still standing there. But the window was empty. The house was as silent and lifeless as ever, and I started to convince myself that it had just been a bad dream. But then, the next night came. I was in bed again, the window slightly open, the cool night air drifting in. I didn't want to look, but something inside me told me I had to. I rolled over and glanced out the window. The man was back. He was standing in the same spot, staring at me with those wide, unblinking eyes. My chest tightened as panic surged through me. I quickly closed the window, locking it this time, and pulled the curtains shut. But even with them closed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching me through the fabric. I told my parents about it the next morning, but they brushed it off. "There's no one living in that house, Jack," my mom said with a laugh. "You've just got an overactive imagination, Dot." But I knew what I saw. I knew he was real. Every night for the next week, the man was there, always in the same spot, always watching me from that filthy window. I stopped opening my curtains entirely, trying to block him out. But even with the curtains closed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still staring at me, that his eyes were still on me. One night I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. I didn't know what had woken me, but I had the overwhelming sense that something was wrong. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and glanced toward the window. The curtains were open. I froze, panic flooding my veins. I knew I had closed them before going to bed. I knew I had locked the window. But there they were wide open, the moonlight streaming in. And standing in the window of the house across the street was the man. But this time, he wasn't just standing there. He was closer. His face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking, and he was smiling. A slow, unnatural smile that sent chills down my spine. I scrambled out of bed, bolting down the hallway to my parents' room. I tried to tell them about the man, about the open window, but they were half asleep and told me I was just having nightmares. I ended up sleeping on their floor that night, too afraid to go back to my room. The next day, I didn't open the curtains at all. I kept my window locked, my door closed, trying to pretend that everything was normal. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard something. A tap. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the window. I pulled the covers over my head, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was outside, but the tapping didn't stop. Slowly, I peeked out from under the covers, my eyes drifting toward the window. The man was there, outside my window. His face was pressed against the glass, his breath fogging up the pane as he tapped gently with his fingers. His eyes were wide, dark, and empty, and his smile was even wider now, stretching unnaturally across his face. I screamed. My parents came running, flipping on the lights, but by the time they reached my room, the man was gone. The window was closed, locked just as I had left it, and the curtains were drawn. But I knew what I had seen. I knew he had been there. After that night, I refused to sleep in my room. I moved into the guest room, keeping the door locked every night. I never opened the windows again, and I made sure the curtains were always drawn. I don't know who or what that man was, but sometimes on quiet nights I can still hear the tapping. Story 11, the watcher in the hallway, a presence you can't escape. Sam always prided himself on being a logical person. He was the kind of guy who needed proof, evidence, something concrete before he'd believe in anything remotely supernatural. So when he moved into his new apartment in an old building on the outskirts of town, he didn't think twice about the rumors. People said the place was haunted, that strange things happened in the hallways at night. Sam just laughed it off, chalking it up to local ghost stories designed to spook newcomers. The apartment itself was perfect, small but comfortable, with a long, narrow hallway that led from the front door to the living room. The hallway had a series of old photographs lining the walls, images of the building from decades past, its former tenants staring out in black and white silence. Sam found them oddly charming, a nod to the building's history. But as the days passed, he started to notice something strange. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on at first, just a feeling like he wasn't alone. Sometimes, when he was walking down the hallway late at night, he'd feel a shiver run down his spine, a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. He told himself it was just the old building settling, the way old places tend to do. Then one night, while he was up late reading in the living room, he heard a faint sound coming from the hallway. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against the wall. Sam's first thought was that a neighbor was moving around upstairs, but the noise seemed to grow louder, more insistent, coming closer to his apartment door. Sam put down his book and walked to the hallway. As he approached, the tapping stopped abruptly. He stood there for a moment, straining to hear anything else, but all he could sense was the silence pressing in on him. With a shake of his head, he turned and headed back to the living room, convinced it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But that was only the beginning. The next night, as Sam was brushing his teeth, he glanced into the hallway mirror and saw a shadow standing at the far end of the hall. It was tall and thin, almost humanoid but not quite. Its limbs seemed elongated, twisted, like they were stretching toward him. He blinked, and the shadow was gone, the hallway empty, as if nothing had been there. Sam's pulse quickened as he stared into the empty space. He told himself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the streetlights outside. But the image of that figure, its unnatural shape, was burned into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something real, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Determined to prove that he was just being paranoid, Sam set up a small camera in the hallway that night, pointing it directly at where he had seen the shadow. He hit record and went to bed, trying to convince himself that he'd find nothing but an empty hallway in the morning. When he woke up, Sam hesitated before checking the camera. He took a deep breath and pressed play, watching the footage scroll by on fast forward. For hours, nothing happened. The hallway remained still, bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight. And then, just after 3 a.m., the camera picked up something, a movement, a flicker in the darkness. The shadow reappeared, this time closer to the camera, its form more distinct. Sam felt his breath hitch as he saw the figure step out of the darkness, its head tilting slightly, as if observing the camera. It didn't move like a person, it seemed to glide, its limbs bending in unnatural angles, like a puppet on invisible strings. And then it did something that made Sam's blood run cold. It turned to face the camera directly, and though it had no visible features, Sam could feel its gaze, like it was looking right at him through the screen, as if it knew he was watching. The camera suddenly cut to static, the screen filled with a burst of white noise, and when the image returned, the hallway was empty again. Sam stared at the screen, his hands shaking. He rewound the footage and played it again, over and over, but each time the figure vanished into the static, leaving him with more questions than answers. That night, Sam could hardly sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadow in the hallway, the way it seemed to reach out to him, calling to him in silence. He lay in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building, every sound amplified in the darkness. Around 3 a.m., he heard it again, the soft tapping sound coming from the hallway. Sam sat up, his heart pounding, and turned on the light. The tapping stopped immediately, but he could feel a presence, a coldness in the air that seemed to press against his skin. He got out of bed and opened the door to the hallway, and there it was. The shadow stood at the far end of the hall, its head tilted to one side, watching him. Sam's breath caught in his throat as the figure took a step toward him, and then another, its movements slow and deliberate. He backed away, his hands shaking, and slammed the bedroom door shut. He grabbed his phone and dialed his best friend, Mark, who knew about the strange occurrences in the apartment. "Mark, I need you to come over right now," Sam said, his voice trembling. "There's something in my hallway. I don't know what it is, but it's here." Mark arrived within minutes, finding Sam pale and shaken at the apartment door. Together, they stepped into the hallway, Mark holding a flashlight. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty corridor. The shadow was gone. "You sure you saw something?" Mark asked, though his voice carried a note of doubt. Sam nodded, his face set with determination. "I'm not crazy, Mark. I've got footage of it. There's something here, watching me. I can feel it." Mark looked skeptical but agreed to stay the night on the couch. They set up a series of cameras, all pointing down the hallway, determined to catch whatever was haunting Sam's apartment. They watched the live feed in silence, waiting for something, anything, to appear. Around 3:15 a.m., the room seemed to grow colder, a chill settling over them. And then there was the shadow flickering into view at the end of the hallway. This time it didn't just stand there. It started to move, its limbs twisting, bending as it crept closer. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. The figure moved to the nearest photograph on the wall, a picture of the building's original tenants, and touched it with one elongated finger. The glass cracked instantly, spiderwebbing across the surface, as the shadow's touch spread through the frame. Sam and Mark stared in horror as the shadow turned, and for the first time it spoke. A low, raspy whisper filled the air, words forming in a language neither of them understood. The hallway lights flickered, dimming to almost nothing, and the shadow seemed to grow, its form expanding, filling the space. "You have seen too much," it whispered, the voice sounding like it came from the walls themselves. "You are not welcome here." And just like that, the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Sam felt a rush of cold air blast through the hallway, and when the lights flickered back on, the shadow was gone. The photographs on the wall had all shattered, their pieces littering the floor. Mark turned to Sam, his face pale and stunned. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Now." They grabbed what they could and bolted from the apartment, not stopping until they were outside in the crisp night air. Sam's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. He knew that shadow wasn't just a ghost or a trick of the light, it was something far older, far darker. The next day, Sam decided to research the building's history. He discovered that it had once been a boarding house in the early 1900s, a place where people mysteriously vanished without a trace. The legend spoke of a figure known as the Watcher, an entity that dwelled in the hallways, feeding on the fear of those who lived there. The Watcher was said to be a guardian of the building's secrets, a sentinel that ensured the souls trapped within its walls never found peace. Those who saw the Watcher were marked, chosen to join the others lost in the building's endless corridors, never to be seen again. Sam moved out of the apartment that very week, but the memory of that night, the feeling of the Watcher's gaze upon him, never left. He could still see it sometimes, in the corner of his eye, in the darkened hallways of his new place. The tapping would start late at night, a reminder that he could never truly escape. And every time he looked into a mirror or a shadowed corner, he half expected to see it there, the Watcher, waiting, watching, ready to reclaim what belonged to it. Sam knew then that the Watcher wasn't bound to that old building. It had followed him, marked him, as one of its own. And no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, it would always be there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for him to slip back into its grasp. Story 12, the clock that ticks backward, time moves against you. Elena had always been fascinated by antique shops, the kind that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets within their dusty shelves. One chilly afternoon, she wandered into a small, out-of-the-way store that she had never noticed before. The shop was packed with old furniture, faded books, and curiosities from another era. But what caught her eye was a peculiar clock, tucked away on a high shelf in the corner. It was a grandfather clock, tall and ornate, with a dark wooden frame and brass details that glinted in the dim light. The pendulum swayed back and forth, and its face was carved with delicate, intricate patterns. But what struck Alina as odd was the direction of its hands. They moved backward, ticking in reverse. Intrigued, she asked the shopkeeper about it. The old man's eyes seemed to darken slightly as he looked at the clock. "Ah, the timepiece that defies time," he said with a crooked smile. "It's said to be a rare piece, one that doesn't just tell the hours, it changes them. People say it's cursed, but I think of it more as misunderstood." Alina, always a skeptic, laughed off the idea of a cursed clock. She loved the strange and the unusual, and this clock seemed like the perfect addition to her apartment. Without hesitation, she bought it, unaware of the darkness she was bringing into her life. When she got home, she placed the clock in her living room, its presence adding a touch of old-world charm to the space. She wound it up, listening to the satisfying click of its gears, and watched as the hands continued their backward journey. For a while, the clock was just an interesting conversation piece, a quirky relic from the past. But then, the strangeness began. Elena first noticed it when she was getting ready for work. She checked the time on her phone. It was 7:45 a.m. She glanced at the clock, and to her surprise, it showed 7:15 a.m., the hands ticking steadily backward. She laughed, thinking it must be stuck or malfunctioning, and went on with her day. But as the days went by, she started noticing more than just the odd time on the clock. Moments in her life seemed to rewind. One evening, as she was making dinner, she accidentally knocked over a glass of water. She watched in shock as the water spilled across the counter, only for it to suddenly draw back into the glass, as though the moment had reversed itself. She blinked, staring at the dry countertop, wondering if she was losing her mind. The incidents became more frequent. She would drop her keys, only to watch them rise back into her hand. Conversations she'd had with friends would suddenly reset, as if she'd never said a word. Elena tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew it had something to do with the clock. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard an extra tick, slow and deliberate, echoing through the quiet apartment. It was different from the regular rhythm of the clock. She sat up, listening, and felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The sound seemed to pulse through the walls, a heartbeat of time moving in reverse. She got out of bed and walked into the living room, her eyes fixed on the clock. The hands moved faster now, spinning backward in a blur, the ticking sound growing louder, almost like whispers hidden beneath the beat. She reached out to touch the clock, and the moment her fingers brushed its surface, everything stopped. The room went silent, frozen in place. She pulled her hand back in shock, and as soon as she did, the world snapped back to life, but not quite as it had been. The furniture was slightly different, the lights dimmer, and the air felt heavy, as if the room was filled with a presence she couldn't see. Elena's mind raced. She felt as though she had stepped into a different version of her own apartment, a place that looked the same but felt fundamentally wrong. The clock stood there, its hands ticking backward in a steady, relentless rhythm, almost as if it were mocking her. She decided she needed to get rid of it. This clock was more than just an antique, it was a gateway to something beyond her understanding. The next morning, she packed it up and drove to the antique store, determined to return it. But when she got there, the shop was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. Elena stood on the empty sidewalk, her hands trembling. She checked the address, certain she was in the right place, but there was nothing there. Just a vacant lot, overgrown with weeds, with no sign that a shop had ever stood there. She drove home in a daze, the clock still in her back seat, ticking louder now, each sound like a knife against her nerves. She didn't know what to do. Every time she thought about smashing it, breaking it to pieces, a sense of dread filled her, as if the clock itself was warning her not to. That night, the strangeness reached its peak. Elena sat in her living room, staring at the clock, determined to confront it once and for all. As she watched, the clock's hands began to move faster, the ticking growing louder and louder, until it sounded like a roar in her ears. The pendulum swung wildly, back and forth, casting shadows that twisted across the walls. Suddenly, the air around her seemed to ripple, and Elena felt herself pulled backward. It was as if time itself had snapped, yanking her out of the present. She found herself standing in her kitchen, holding the same glass of water she'd spilled days ago. But this time, the water didn't fall to the counter. It hovered in midair, droplets suspended like tiny orbs, before slowly moving back into the glass. She felt sick, like her whole body was being pulled inside out. Memories she'd forgotten flashed before her eyes in reverse, playing out scenes from her life like a film unwinding. Her childhood home, her first love, her heartbreaks, all flickering past her in quick succession. And then, to her horror, she saw things she didn't remember at all. Images of herself in different places, different times, standing in rooms she'd never been in, talking to people she didn't know. It was as if the clock wasn't just taking her back through her own past, but through lives she had never lived. She watched herself grow younger, her face smoothing out, her hair darkening, until she was a child again, then an infant, then nothing more than a thought on the edge of existence. Elena screamed, a sound that seemed to echo through the fabric of reality itself, and suddenly she was back in her living room, the clocks ticking, the only sound in the world. She was on her knees, gasping for breath, her hands clutching the floor. She looked up at the clock, and its hands were still moving, ticking backward at a steady pace. But now, she could see the truth. The face of the clock wasn't just a dial. It was an eye that watched her, unblinking, calculating. It was alive, and it was alive, and it was aware of her. She realized that the clock wasn't just measuring time, it was feeding on it, pulling moments from her life and consuming them. Desperate, Elena grabbed a hammer from her toolbox and swung it at the clock with all her strength. The hammer connected, and for a moment she felt resistance. But instead of shattering, the clock seemed to absorb the impact, rippling like water. A laugh, hollow and metallic, echoed from its depths. Futile, a voice whispered from within the clock, a sound that seemed to come from every corner of the room at once. Time cannot be destroyed, only consumed. The pendulum stopped swinging, and the hands of the clock reversed their direction, now moving forward at a terrifying speed. The room around her began to age. Dust thickened on the surfaces, paint peeled from the walls, the lights flickered and went out. The world was moving on without her, dragging her into a future that was not her own. No, she screamed, as the clock's laughter grew louder. "You can't have me." And then, everything went silent. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in the empty apartment, the same apartment, but it wasn't hers anymore. The clock was gone. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the windows were boarded up. She heard voices outside, muffled conversations about the old place where the woman disappeared years ago. Elena ran to the door, but when she opened it, she found herself looking out into the same room she had just left, like a reflection, a loop that had no end. She was trapped, caught in the clock's endless game. No matter where she turned, the door always led her back to the same empty space. The last thing she saw, in the corner of the room, was a flash of brass, a new clock, identical to the one she had bought, ticking steadily backward. She realized then that she was no longer outside of time, but part of it, another memory caught within the gears of its impossible machine. And now, every time the clock ticks, it moves closer to the next person who dares to wind its gears, to touch its face, to believe. They can control time. But Elena will always be there, just a shadow within the clock's glass, watching, waiting, a prisoner of moments that will never truly belong to her again. Story 13, the call from the basement, voices from below. Sophie had never liked basements. Growing up, the one in her family home was always a place she avoided. It was dark, cold, and filled with old boxes and forgotten memories. So when she moved into her new house and saw the basement door in the hallway, a familiar unease crept over her. Still, she shrugged it off. It was just a basement, after all, nothing more. For the first few weeks, Sophie didn't think much about it. She kept the door closed and tried not to venture down there. Life in the new house was busy, and there were enough things to focus on without worrying about a dusty, unused room. But that all changed one evening when the phone rang. Sophie was in the living room, unpacking boxes, when she heard the faint ringing of a phone. It wasn't her cell phone, which lay silent on the table beside her. This ringing was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deep in the house. She followed the sound down the hallway, her ears straining to pinpoint its source. It was coming from the basement. Her stomach twisted as she stared at the basement door, the ringing growing louder, echoing up the stairs. Sophie hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She didn't have a landline in the house, just her cell phone. So what was ringing down there? Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. Cold air wafted up from the darkness below, carrying with it the faint, musty smell of earth and mold. The ringing continued, more insistent now, urging her to come closer. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the first step, then another, the wood creaking under her weight. As she descended into the darkness, the ringing became clearer, more tangible, like it was pulling her into its grip. She reached the bottom of the stairs and swung the flashlight beam across the room, revealing old furniture covered with dusty sheets, stacks of boxes, and a tangle of cobwebs. The sound was coming from a small, antique rotary phone sitting on a table in the far corner of the basement. Sophie stared at it in disbelief. The phone looked ancient, with a faded black casing and a heavy receiver. Its rotary dial was cracked, the numbers barely visible. She had never seen this phone before and had no idea how it got there. And yet, it was ringing. She reached out with a trembling hand, hesitating before finally picking up the receiver. The ringing stopped abruptly, replaced by a crackling silence that seemed to stretch on forever. "Hello," she said, her voice barely a whisper. There was no answer at first, just a faint static on the line. Then, a voice came through, soft and distant, as if speaking from the depths of a well. "Sophie," it said, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. You need to help me, the voice continued, ignoring her question. I'm trapped. Please. You have to find me. Sophie's heart raced. The voice sounded familiar, like an echo of her own thoughts, yet distorted, twisted. Who are you? Where are you trapped, she asked, her voice shaking. But there was no response, just a burst of static, followed by the dull click of the line disconnecting. She stared at the phone in her hand, unable to comprehend what had just happened. She quickly hung up, turned on her heel, and fled back up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. She spent the rest of the evening trying to convince herself that it had all been a prank, some old wiring in the house picking up a random signal, maybe. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the call was real, that someone or something was trying to reach out to her from the darkness below. The next few nights were restless. Sophie lay in bed, her mind filled with the sound of that ringing phone and the desperate voice on the other end. She avoided the basement at all costs, but she couldn't avoid the growing sense of dread that followed her through every room of the house. Then, just as she was starting to convince herself that it was all in her head, the phone rang again. It was late, well past midnight, when the familiar sound echoed through the quiet house. Sophie sat bolt upright in bed, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The ringing came from the basement, louder this time, more urgent. She grabbed her flashlight and her phone, dialing her best friend Emma's number as she headed toward the door. Emma, she said as soon as her friend picked up. It's happening again. The phone is ringing in the basement. Are you sure it's not just a dream? Emma replied, her voice groggy with sleep. No, Sophie insisted. I'm wide awake, and it's real. I need you to come over, please. Okay, I'm on my way, Emma said, now fully alert. Don't go down there until I get there. Sophie agreed, but as soon as she hung up, the ringing grew even louder, almost like a scream demanding her attention. She couldn't wait. She had to know who was on the other end. Before she could stop herself, she was at the basement door, opening it and descending the stairs once more. When she reached the bottom, the phone was already in her hand, the receiver cold against her skin. She lifted it to her ear, the static hissing like 1,000 whispers. Hello, she said, her voice shaking. This time the voice was clearer, more intense, almost like a mirror of her own. Sophie, please, it begged. I'm you. I'm trapped down here. You have to help me before it's too late. What do you mean? You're me, Sophie demanded, her mind reeling. This is insane. Listen, the voice said, urgent and trembling. The basement is a doorway to something else. If you don't help me, you'll be next. Don't let it take you. Before Sophie could respond, the basement light flickered and then went out, plunging her into darkness. The temperature in the room plummeted, and she felt a presence cold, malevolent, something lurking just beyond her vision. The phone crackled again, but this time it wasn't her voice on the line. It was something else, something darker. A deep, hollow laughter filled the receiver, echoing through the basement. You cannot escape, the new voice whispered, its tone mocking. She is already lost. And now it's your turn. Sophie's breath hitched as she dropped the phone, the clatter echoing in the silence. She fumbled for her flashlight and turned it on, sweeping the beam across the room. There in the corner, she saw a shadow shifting, twisting, slowly forming into a figure that seemed to step out of the darkness itself. The shape moved toward her, its form undefined, like smoke trapped in the shape of a human, eyes glowing with an eerie light. Sophie stumbled back, her mind screaming to get away, to run. She turned and raced up the stairs, her feet pounding on the wood, each step echoing like a drumbeat. Just as she reached the top, the basement door slammed shut, trapping her hand between the frame and the door. She cried out in pain, yanking her hand free, and managed to throw the door open. She stumbled into the hallway just as Emma arrived, breathless and wide-eyed. Sophie, Emma shouted, grabbing her by the shoulders. What happened? Are you okay? The basement, Sophie gasped. There's something down there. It said it was me, but it's not. It's not me. Emma looked confused but resolute. We need to see this thing, she said. Whatever it is, we're going to face it together. Armed with flashlights and a heavy sense of dread, they descended the stairs once more. But when they reached the bottom, the basement was empty. The rotary phone sat silent on the table, the air still and cold, like a tomb. You sure you heard something? Emma asked, though her voice was now laced with doubt. Sophie stared at the phone, her mind spinning. It was here, she whispered. I swear, it was here. Just as they were about to leave, the phone rang again, sharper, louder than before. Emma jumped back, and Sophie's heart stopped. She reached out, hesitated for a moment, then picked up the receiver. But this time, there was no static, no voice, just a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something drumming against the phone's casing. And then the voice returned, faint and distant. It's too late, it said. You shouldn't have answered. Before they could react, the basement light flickered on and off, and the temperature dropped even further. The shadows on the wall began to move, coalescing into the shape of a figure that looked exactly like Sophie, only twisted, distorted, its face a mask of fear and anger. You didn't save me, the doppelganger hissed, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. Now you'll join me in the dark. The room plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the hum of the phone's dial tone, ringing louder and louder until it drowned out all thought. Sophie felt herself being pulled, dragged toward the shadowy figure, its arms outstretched, ready to consume her. And then, as quickly as it began, everything stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the basement was empty once more. The phone lay on the floor, silent. Emma reached out and shook Sophie, who seemed frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. Let's get out of here, Emma whispered, and together they fled the basement, slamming the door shut behind them. Sophie moved out of the house the very next day, leaving the basement and its secrets behind. But even in her new apartment, she could still hear it sometimes, the faint ringing of a rotary phone, calling to her from some forgotten place below. And every time it rang, she knew the truth. The call from the basement was not just a cry for help. It was a warning, a curse, a reminder that somewhere in the darkness, another version of her was waiting to take her place. Story 14, the face in the window, eyes that never blink. Maggie had just moved into a small, quaint house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and an eerie kind of quiet that was a far cry from the noise of the city. She thought it would be a peaceful place to focus on her writing, a place where inspiration could find her without distractions. But her first night in the new house, she began to feel that the silence held secrets. The living room had large windows that looked out onto the front yard. Maggie loved the idea of natural light flooding in during the day, but at night, those windows took on a different character. The darkness outside seemed to press against the glass, and it was impossible to see anything beyond her own reflection. On her first evening, as she was unpacking a box of books, Maggie caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A face, pale, gaunt, staring at her from the window. She gasped, turning quickly to get a better look, but saw only her own reflection and the darkness beyond. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, the result of exhaustion from the long day of unpacking. But that image of the face wouldn't leave her mind. It lingered in her thoughts like a shadow creeping into the corners of her consciousness, even when she tried to forget. The following night, Maggie sat at her desk, typing away on her laptop, the glow of the screen casting a soft light around her. The windows were a black mirror, and she tried not to look at them, telling herself that it was silly to be afraid of something that wasn't there. But then she saw it again. The face was back, clearer this time, pressed against the window like it was trying to peer inside. Its eyes were wide, too wide, and its mouth was slightly open, like it was on the verge of whispering something. Maggie's heart jumped into her throat as she spun around in her chair, only to find the window empty once more. She jumped to her feet, rushing to turn on all the lights in the house. She closed the curtains, every one of them, and tried to convince herself that she was just tired, that her eyes were playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the truth. The face she'd seen was too real, too vivid to be a figment of her imagination. Over the next few days, the sightings became more frequent. Each night, no matter how tightly she closed the curtains or how many lights she turned on, Maggie would catch glimpses of the face in the window. Sometimes it was watching her from the kitchen window, sometimes from the living room. Always the same face, pale, expressionless, with those eyes that never blinked. Desperate for answers, Maggie called her friend Jess, who was always the rational one in their group. "You're just stressed," Jess said over the phone. "Moving is a big deal, and it can mess with your head. How about I come over and we can check it out together?" Maggie agreed, and the next evening, Jess showed up with a flashlight and a determined look on her face. They went around the house, checking the windows, looking for any sign of someone lurking outside. They found nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze and the sound of leaves rustling in the darkness. "See? There's no one out there," Jess said, trying to sound convincing. "It's probably just the reflection of your own face. Sometimes when it's dark outside and you're lit up inside, your brain can play tricks on you." Maggie nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As they settled in for the night, Jess made light of the situation, telling funny stories to ease the tension. Maggie almost started to believe her friend that maybe it was all in her head. But then, just as they were about to call it a night, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, the sudden silence almost deafening. Maggie's heart raced as she reached for her flashlight, the beam shaking slightly in her trembling hand. Jess stood still, staring toward the window. "Maggie," Jess whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't move." Maggie followed her gaze to the window and felt her blood turn to ice. The face was there, pressed right against the glass. Only this time, it wasn't just a face, it was a whole figure. A gaunt, shadowy figure with eyes like black voids staring in at them. Its mouth opened, revealing a wide, hollow grin, and it raised one skeletal hand to the glass. The figure didn't move like a person. It seemed to flicker, like an image on a glitchy screen, shifting in and out of focus, yet its eyes never left Maggie's. Jess stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, her face pale with terror. "What the hell is that?" Jess gasped, barely able to get the words out. Maggie couldn't answer. She felt like the figure was pulling her in, its eyes locking onto hers, dragging her deeper into the darkness that seemed to surround it. Then, just as suddenly, the power came back on. The lights flickered to life, and the figure vanished. They both stood there, shaking, staring at the empty window. Jess grabbed her phone, hands trembling as she dialed the police. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice cracking. "Now." They fled the house and waited outside on the cold driveway until the police arrived. The officers searched the entire property, checked the yard, and even looked through the nearby woods. They found no sign of anyone, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. "It could have been a trespasser," one of the officers said, though he sounded doubtful. "Or a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from inside." Maggie and Jess knew what they'd seen, but no amount of explaining would make the officers believe them. After the police left, Jess insisted on staying the night, but Maggie couldn't relax. She kept seeing that face every time she closed her eyes, that grin that seemed to taunt her from the other side of the window. As the hours passed and Jess finally fell asleep on the couch, Maggie stayed awake, staring at the window. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the silence felt like a living thing, pressing in on her from all sides. And then, at around 3 a.m., she heard a soft tapping on the glass. She turned her head slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. The face was back, but this time it was closer than ever, pressed against the glass with its hollow eyes fixed on her. Maggie felt a scream rise in her throat, but it caught there, trapped by the terror that froze her in place. The face mouthed something, a single word that fogged the glass. "Come dot." Maggie shook her head, backing away slowly. But the figure's eyes followed her every move, and its grin widened, as if it knew a secret she could never understand. She grabbed her phone, aimed its flashlight at the window, and for a moment the light revealed something horrifying. The figure wasn't outside. It was inside the glass itself, like a twisted reflection trapped within the window pane, its face pressed against the other side of reality. Its hand reached out, its fingers splayed against the glass, as though it was trying to break through. With trembling hands, Maggie yanked the curtains closed, but it didn't matter. She could still feel the thing watching her, could almost hear its breath against the glass, whispering her name over and over. She tried to wake Jess, shaking her by the shoulders. "Jess, wake up," Maggie shouted. "We have to leave. Now." Jess woke up groggy and confused, but when she saw the panic in Maggie's eyes, she didn't hesitate. They grabbed their things and ran out of the house into the night. Maggie refused to look back at the windows, afraid of what she might see staring back at her. They stayed at a motel for the rest of the night, huddled together, not saying a word. Maggie's mind raced with thoughts of the face in the window, the way it seemed to live inside the glass. She knew now that it wasn't just an intruder or a trick of the light. The next day, they went back to the house in broad daylight. Maggie's heart sank when she saw that every window had cracked from the inside, tiny fractures spiderwebbing across the glass, as if something had tried to force its way through. She moved out of the house that week, unable to bear the thought of living there another day. But even after she settled into a new place, she couldn't escape the feeling that the face was still watching her. Every time she passed a window or looked into a mirror, she saw the faint outline of those hollow eyes, waiting for her to look just a little too closely. And then one night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard it again, the soft tapping, this time on her bedroom window. She turned slowly, heart pounding, and there it was. The face grinning back at her, its eyes gleaming in the dark. It whispered her name, a sound like wind through broken glass. Come Dot. And she knew then that the face in the window wasn't just trapped, it was waiting. And it would. Never stop until it found a way to pull her through. Story 15, The Whisper Under the Bed, Secrets Beneath the Silence. Katie had always considered herself too old to be afraid of the dark. At 28, she had outgrown the childhood fears of monsters lurking in closets or under the bed. But when she moved into her new apartment, a tiny one-bedroom place on the edge of the city, those old fears began to creep back in. The first few nights were normal enough. Katie unpacked her boxes, set up her furniture, and slowly began to settle in. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the occasional creak of the old wooden floors to break the silence. But that stillness brought with it a sense of unease that Katie couldn't shake. One night, as she lay in bed trying to fall asleep, she heard a faint, almost inaudible whisper coming from somewhere below her. She froze, holding her breath, straining her ears to catch the sound again. There it was, soft and slow, like a voice speaking in hushed tones right under her bed. Katie sat up, her eyes wide with alarm. She listened carefully, but the whispering stopped the moment she moved. She reached for her bedside lamp, turning it on, flooding the room with light. She glanced around, her heart racing, but everything looked perfectly normal. She got out of bed and knelt down, peering into the darkness beneath her bed frame. All she could see were a few boxes of books and some old clothes she hadn't found a place for yet, nothing out of the ordinary. Telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, she climbed back into bed and turned off the light. But as soon as the room was dark again, the whispering returned. This time it was clearer, closer. A soft voice speaking words she couldn't quite understand, like a chant or a lullaby sung in reverse. Katie's skin prickled with goosebumps. She turned on the light once more, and just as before, the whispering stopped, leaving her alone in the silence. Katie didn't sleep much that night. She lay awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to convince herself that it was just the house settling, or the wind outside, or maybe even a neighbor's TV set turned too low. Anything but the idea that someone or something was under her bed, whispering to her in the dark. The next morning, after a restless night, she decided to talk to her friend Carla about it. Carla was the practical type, the kind of person who didn't believe in ghosts or things that go bump in the night. "You're just stressed," Carla said when they met for coffee. "New place, different noises. Old buildings make sounds you're not used to. It's probably nothing." Katie nodded, trying to believe her friend's rational explanation. But that night, when she lay down in bed and turned off the light, the whispering came back louder, clearer, more insistent. She could almost make out words this time, fragments of sentences that seemed to echo in her mind. "Come." Closer the voice whispered, so softly that it was almost like a breeze brushing against her ear. "I'm waiting." Katie's blood turned to ice. She lay still, her muscles tense, staring into the darkness, too afraid to move. The voice was so close, it felt like whoever was speaking was just inches away from her face. Summoning all her courage, Katie jumped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and pointed it at the floor. She knelt down slowly, lifting the dust ruffle that hung down from the mattress, and shone the light into the darkness beneath her bed. The beam illuminated nothing but the old boxes, a few stray socks, and the cold wooden floor. There was no sign of anyone or anything hiding there. She let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she tried to steady the flashlight. But just as she was about to turn away, she heard it again this time, directly in her ear. "Don't leave me alone down here," the voice said, clear and pleading. Katie stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, her heart racing. The whisper had been so real, so close, that she could almost feel the breath on her skin. She ran to the living room, turned on every light in the apartment, and grabbed her phone. She didn't know who to call or what to say, but she knew she couldn't stay in the bedroom, not after what she had just heard. Desperate for answers, she reached out to the landlord the next morning, asking if he knew anything strange about the apartment's history. "It's an old building," the landlord said dismissively. "Settles a lot at night. Sometimes you'll hear creaks and groans, but that's normal. Haven't had any complaints from the last tenant." Katie pressed for more details, but the landlord seemed reluctant to say much else. The last tenant left pretty quickly, he admitted. Said she was moving for a job. "But you know, people come and go all the time in this business." Feeling frustrated and unnerved, Katie decided to do some digging on her own. She searched online for any information she could find about the apartment, looking up old records, news articles, anything that might explain the strange occurrences. And then, buried in the archives of a local news website, she found something that made her blood run cold. The apartment had been the scene of a disappearance nearly 10 years ago. A woman named Lydia Collins had lived there, and one night, she simply vanished without a trace. Her belongings were left untouched, her front door locked from the inside. The only clue was a chilling note scrawled on a piece of paper left on her bed: "Don't let them take me under." Katie's hands shook as she stared at the words on the screen. She felt a growing sense of dread, a fear that tightened around her like a vice. She knew then that the whispers weren't just her imagination, and that they were connected to Lydia's disappearance. That night, as Katie lay in bed, she didn't bother turning off the light. She knew the whisper would come, whether the room was dark or not. And it did, softer this time, almost like a sigh, a whisper from another world. "Help me," the voice said, barely audible. "Please, don't leave me down here." Katie's fear turned to determination. She grabbed her flashlight and, with a deep breath, slowly crouched down to look under the bed once more. This time she reached out, moving the boxes aside, her fingers trembling as she brushed against the cold floor. And then she saw it. A small, hollow space carved into the floorboards, just big enough for a hand to reach through. Her flashlight flickered, and for a split second she saw something else's fingers, pale and thin, gripping the edge of the hole. Katie's breath caught in her throat as a face emerged from the darkness beneath the bed. It was the face of a woman, gaunt, terrified, her eyes wide and pleading. Her lips cracked and dry as she mouthed the words, "Don't let them take me back." Katie screamed and scrambled away, her flashlight rolling across the floor. The woman's face, Lydia's face, twisted into an expression of horror, and then she was gone, sucked back into the darkness beneath the bed. Katie slammed her bedroom door shut and called the police, her voice shaking as she told them about the hidden space under the bed, about the face she had seen. They arrived within minutes, searching the apartment, pulling up floorboards, tearing apart the room. They found nothing. No hidden space, no evidence of anyone under the bed, just dust and old wood. The officer in charge gave her a sympathetic look, suggesting that maybe she'd experienced a vivid dream or sleep paralysis, but Katie knew the truth. She knew that Lydia Collins was still down there, trapped in a place that wasn't quite of this world. And whatever had taken her was still waiting, hiding in the shadows, whispering to her through the darkness. Katie moved out of the apartment the very next day, refusing to spend another night in that cursed place. But even in her new home, she couldn't escape the whispers. She would hear them in the dead of night, just as she was drifting off to sleep, a soft voice calling to her from beneath the bed. "Don't leave me," the whisper said. "I'm still here, waiting." And she knew then that no matter where she went, she would never truly escape the voice under the bed. It would always follow her, always whisper to her, always remind her that there are things in the dark that you can't just walk away from. Things that never stop watching. Things that never stop waiting. It wasn't the kind of thing I would normally agree to. In fact, if someone had asked me a month ago if I wanted to spend the night sneaking into an abandoned amusement park, I would have said they were crazy. But there I was, standing in front of the rusted gates of Dreamland, an amusement park that had been closed for over 20 years, wondering what had possessed me to come along for the ride. It had been Ryan's idea. He was the adventurous one in our group, always looking for something thrilling or dangerous to do. "Come on, man," he'd said, grinning from ear to ear. "When's the next time you'll get a chance to check out a place like this?" The answer, of course, was never. Places like this didn't exist anymore, not the way they did when we were kids. Dreamland had been shut down long before any of us were old enough to visit. But we had heard the stories, the urban legends about accidents, about the place being haunted. People in town still talked about it sometimes, saying it wasn't just the park that was abandoned, but something worse had been left behind. None of that had deterred Ryan, though. When he found out that the old park was still standing, untouched and mostly forgotten, he had decided we had to check it out. It's just a bit of fun, he'd said. What's the worst that could happen? As I stood there, staring up at the faded sign hanging crookedly over the entrance, I could think of plenty of things that could go wrong. Ryan stood beside me, bouncing on the balls of his feet like a kid about to open presents on Christmas morning. "You ready?" he asked, his grin wide. "I don't know," I muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "This place gives me the creeps." "You're just being paranoid," Ryan laughed, clapping me on the back. "Come on, it'll be fun." Emily and Sarah, the other two members of our little group, were already climbing through a gap in the fence. Emily glanced back at us, her eyes glinting with excitement. "Hurry up, you two. We don't want to get caught standing out here." Ryan and I exchanged a glance, then followed them through the fence. Once inside, the first thing that hit me was the silence. The park had once been alive with the sounds of laughter, music, and the clattering of rides. But now, it was deathly quiet. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of rust and decay, and the ground beneath our feet was littered with debris, broken glass, old candy wrappers, and pieces of twisted metal. We walked deeper into the park, our footsteps crunching loudly on the cracked pavement. The rides loomed around us like skeletal ghosts, their metal frames rusted and broken. The Ferris wheel, once the park's centerpiece, stood in the distance, its cars hanging at odd angles, swaying gently in the breeze. The roller coaster tracks twisted and turned above us like the skeleton of some long-dead beast, the cars long since removed or lost to time. "This is so cool," Ryan whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Can you imagine what this place must have been like when it was still open?" "I can't," I admitted, my voice tight with unease. The place felt wrong, like we didn't belong here. The air was too still, the silence too thick. I kept expecting to hear something, a distant echo of laughter, the faint hum of carnival music, but there was nothing. Emily and Sarah were walking ahead of us, their voices soft as they marveled at the state of the park. They seemed completely at ease, as if they were wandering through an old museum instead of an abandoned amusement park with a reputation for being cursed. Ryan nudged me. "Come on, don't be such a buzzkill. It's just an old park. No one's been here in years." I nodded, trying to push the unease from my mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just overreacting. It was, after all, just an old amusement park. What was the worst that could happen? We wandered through the park for a while, exploring the dilapidated rides and crumbling buildings. Ryan was in his element, climbing onto the rusted tracks of the roller coaster, taking pictures of the decaying attractions, and telling us stories about what the park used to be like. Emily and Sarah seemed to be enjoying themselves too, snapping photos and laughing at the absurdity of sneaking into an old, abandoned park in the middle of the night. But the longer we stayed, the more I felt like we were being watched. It was a subtle feeling at first, a prickling on the back of my neck, the sense that there were eyes on us, following our every move. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was no one. Just the empty park, shrouded in darkness and silence. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. Every time we rounded a corner or approached a new ride, I felt that same unsettling sensation, the hairs on my arms standing on end, my heartbeat quickening. It felt like the park itself was alive, watching us, waiting for something. "You okay?" Sarah asked, noticing my discomfort. Yeah, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Just, I don't know. This place is weird. Weird, but cool, Ryan said, jumping down from the roller coaster tracks. Come on, I want to check out the fun house. I grimaced. The fun house had always been a source of local legend. It was said to be one of the first rides shut down after an accident, and according to the stories, it was cursed. There were rumors that the mirrors inside showed things that weren't really there, reflections of people who had died in the park, or glimpses of your own death. I don't know, man, I said, my stomach twisting with unease. Maybe we should stick to the other rides. Ryan rolled his eyes. What, you're afraid of a bunch of old mirrors? Come on, it's not going to hurt you. I just don't like it, I muttered. Emily and Sarah exchanged glances, but neither of them seemed particularly concerned. It's just a story, Emily said. No one's been in there for years. Exactly, Ryan added. It'll be fun. Reluctantly, I followed them as they made their way toward the funhouse. The building was still standing, though the paint was peeling and the windows were cracked. A large sign above the entrance, once bright and colorful, now hung crookedly, the letters faded and chipped. Ryan pushed open the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. He grinned at us, then disappeared inside. Emily and Sarah followed, and after a moment's hesitation, I stepped in behind them. The interior of the funhouse was just as decayed as the rest of the park. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under our feet. Broken mirrors lined the walls, their surfaces scratched and fogged with grime. The once bright paint on the walls had faded to a dull, lifeless gray, and the distorted reflections in the mirrors made the room feel even more disorienting. This is awesome, Ryan whispered, his voice echoing through the room. It's like stepping into a time capsule. I wasn't so sure. The place felt wrong, like the walls were closing in on us. The air was too still, too quiet, and the mirrors, those damn mirrors, seemed to twist and warp in ways that didn't make sense. I caught glimpses of myself in the reflections, but something was off. My reflection seemed delayed, like it was moving just a fraction of a second behind me. Do you guys see that? I asked, my voice shaking slightly. See what Sarah asked, turning to look at me. The mirrors. They're weird. Ryan laughed. Of course they're weird, dude. They're old funhouse mirrors. They're supposed to look weird. No, I mean, I stopped, glancing at the nearest mirror. My reflection stared back at me, but it didn't feel right. There was something in the way my eyes looked, something dark, something wrong. I stepped closer to the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out, my fingers brushing the glass. And for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw something behind me, a shadow, just out of sight. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, silent and still. You okay? Emily asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I'm fine, I lied, stepping away from the mirror. Let's just get out of here. Ryan groaned. Come on, we just got here. I don't care, I snapped. I don't like this place. Before Ryan could argue, the lights flickered. We all froze, staring up at the ceiling as the dim light bulbs sputtered and buzzed. For a moment, the room was plunged into darkness, and I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. Then, just as suddenly, the lights flickered back on. But something was different. The mirrors, there were more of them. They had shifted, multiplying, filling the room until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. My own reflection stared back at me from a dozen angles, each one distorted, twisted in ways that made my skin crawl. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling, "we need to get out of here." Ryan didn't argue this time. He glanced around the room, his eyes wide with fear. "Where's the door?" I turned, my heart racing. The door we had come through, it was gone. The walls were lined with mirrors, reflecting endless versions of ourselves, but the exit had disappeared. Panic surged through me as I ran toward the nearest wall, my hands slamming against the cold glass. My reflection mimicked me, its eyes wide and terrified, but there was no door, no way out. "This isn't right," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "This can't be real." "Keep looking," Ryan shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "There has to be a way out." We fanned out, frantically searching the walls, but every mirror we touched just reflected our own fear back at us. The room seemed to be shrinking, the air growing colder and thicker with each passing second. The mirrors, those horrible mirrors, seemed to close in on us, their distorted reflections warping and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement in one of the mirrors. I turned to look, my heart pounding in my chest, and for a split second, I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the reflection, just behind me, but when I spun around, there was no one there. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Guys, I think we're not alone." "What are you talking about?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. "There's something in here with us," I whispered. Before I could say anything else, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. The air was thick with the sound of our panicked breathing, and I could feel the walls closing in, the mirrors multiplying, reflecting nothing but darkness. Then, in the silence, I heard it. A soft whisper. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of it, the cadence, the tone, it was wrong. It was like nothing I had ever heard before. The lights flickered back on, and I froze. There, in the mirror, was the figure. It was standing behind us, its form dark and shadowy, its face hidden in the distorted reflection. I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest, and as I watched, it took a step forward. I turned, but again, there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the mirrors reflecting our fear back at us. "We need to go," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "We can't," Ryan shouted. "The door is gone." "We have to do something," Sarah cried. "We can't stay here." I backed away from the mirrors, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Then, as if in answer to my prayers, the lights flickered one last time, and the door appeared. Without hesitation, we ran for it, our footsteps echoing through the room as we bolted for the exit. I didn't look back, didn't glance at the mirrors as we fled. I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We burst through the door, stumbling out into the cool night air. I collapsed to the ground, my hands trembling as I tried to catch my breath. The park was silent, the rides looming around us like skeletal ghosts. But we were alive. We had made it out. I glanced back at the funhouse, my heart still racing. The door was still there, standing slightly ajar, but the mirrors, they were gone. It had been months since I'd taken any time off. The routine of work had worn me down, and I needed an escape, a break from the constant buzz of the city. So I did what I always did when life felt overwhelming. I packed up my car, grabbed my camping gear, and hit the road. There was something soothing about the open highway, the freedom of going anywhere, with no real destination in mind. Just me, my car, and the vast countryside stretching out in all directions. The plan was simple. I'd drive until I found a secluded spot, somewhere off the beaten path, and set up camp for a night or two. No distractions, no deadlines, just the peaceful quiet of nature. I'd been driving for most of the day, the sun hanging low in the sky by the time I found what seemed like the perfect spot, a small clearing just off a lonely stretch of road. It was remote, quiet, and surrounded by dense woods. The kind of place where you wouldn't hear or see another soul for miles. Exactly what I was looking for. I pulled the car over, parked near the tree line, and got out, breathing in the cool evening air. The quiet was immediate, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. A sense of calm washed over me as I took in the surroundings. This was exactly what I needed. After unloading my gear, I set up the tent, built a small fire, and settled in for the evening. The sun had nearly set by the time I finished, casting the sky in shades of deep purple and orange. I made myself a quick dinner over the fire, the warmth of the flames a welcome comfort against the cool night air. By the time the stars began to appear, the world around me had fallen into complete silence. I leaned back in my camping chair, staring up at the clear, star-filled sky. It was breathtaking. No city lights, no traffic, just endless stars twinkling above me, stretching on forever. For a while, I just sat there, enjoying the solitude. There was something so peaceful about being alone in the woods, away from everything. The fire crackled softly, and I felt my body relax, the tension of the last few months slowly melting away. But as the night deepened and the fire began to die down, an uneasy feeling crept into the back of my mind. It was subtle at first, like a faint prickling sensation on the back of my neck, but it was enough to make me sit up a little straighter. I glanced around the clearing, my eyes scanning the darkness just beyond the glow of the fire. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. There was no one out here but me. I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. Still, the sense of unease lingered. I glanced over at the fire, noticing that it had burned down to a smoldering heap of embers. With a sigh, I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, deciding it was time to call it a night. I doused the fire with dirt and water, making sure it was fully out, then made my way to the tent. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead as I approached the tent. The night was eerily quiet now, with even the wind having died down. The only sound was the soft crunch of leaves under my boots as I walked. I unzipped the tent, crawled inside, and zipped it up behind me. The thin walls of the tent made the outside world feel a little too close for comfort, but I told myself it was fine. I'd been camping before, plenty of times. There was nothing out there. I laid down on my sleeping bag, pulling it up to my chest as I stared up at the nylon ceiling. The tent felt small and claustrophobic in the dark, but I forced myself to relax. I needed sleep. It had been a long day, and I had another drive ahead of me tomorrow. For a while, I just lay there, listening to the quiet. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves outside, and I could hear the faint creaking of branches swaying in the breeze. It was peaceful, but the sense of unease I'd felt earlier hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. And then I heard it, a soft crunch, like the sound of footsteps, just outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I strained to listen, every muscle in my body tense. There was again a slow, deliberate crunch, like someone or something was walking through the clearing. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. An animal, maybe? A deer. It had to be. There were no other people out here. No one even knew I was here. But the footsteps, they sounded too heavy, too deliberate. Another crunch. Closer this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the switch. The tent was silent now, but I could feel the presence outside something, or someone was out there. I clicked the flashlight on, the beam casting a faint glow inside the tent. I waited, listening, my breath shallow and uneven. Nothing. Just silence. I was about to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing when there was a sudden, sharp tap against the side of the tent. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat as I scrambled to sit up. The tap came again, softer this time, followed by another, and another like fingers tapping against the nylon fabric. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, my hand trembling as the beam illuminated the side of the tent. The tapping stopped, and for a long moment, everything was still. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the tapping resumed, this time louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there was trying to get in. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. Should I call out? Should I get out of the tent and make a run for it? Before I could make a decision, the tapping stopped. Silence. My heart pounded in my ears as I waited, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I just sat there, staring at the side of the tent, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. Then, without warning, the zipper on the front of the tent began to move. It was slow at first, the faint sound of the zipper being pulled open inch by inch, but it was unmistakable. My blood ran cold as I stared at the zipper, my heart pounding in my chest. Someone was unzipping the tent. I bolted upright, the flashlight clattering to the ground as I grabbed the zipper and yanked it back up, sealing the tent. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I grabbed the flashlight again, shining it around the inside of the tent, as if that would somehow protect me. The sound of the zipper stopped, but the presence outside hadn't gone away. I could feel it, hear it. The soft crunch of footsteps circling the tent, slow and deliberate. Whatever was out there, it was toying with me. I had to get out. I couldn't just sit there and wait for it to come back. I grabbed my boots, my hands shaking as I slipped them on. My mind raced, trying to plan my next move. The car was parked about 30 feet away, just beyond the tree line. If I could make it to the car, I could lock myself inside, start the engine, and get the hell out of there. But first I had to get out of the tent. I reached for the zipper, my hand trembling as I slowly began to pull it down. The tent was silent now, no footsteps, no tapping, but I knew that whatever was out there was still watching, waiting. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and yanked the zipper the rest of the way down. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face as I crawled out of the tent, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the clearing. Nothing. The clearing was empty, just as it had been when I set up camp. The trees stood silent, the wind rustling softly through the leaves. There was no sign of whatever or whoever had been outside the tent. I took a step forward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The car was just ahead, sitting in the darkness like a beacon of safety. If I could just make it to the car, I'd be okay. I started walking, my footsteps crunching softly on the ground as I made my way toward the tree line. My eyes darted around the clearing, searching the shadows for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the trees in the dark. I was almost at the car when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from the woods. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound was faint, but it was there, something moving in the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I shone the flashlight toward the sound, my pulse racing as I took a step back. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but I couldn't see anything. Whatever was making the noise was staying just out of sight. The growling grew louder, more intense, and I could hear the soft rustle of leaves as something moved toward me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, as the flashlight flickered, its beam weakening. "Come on," I muttered, shaking the flashlight in a desperate attempt to keep it from going out. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, its form hidden in the shadows. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were wrong, bent at odd angles. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I turned and bolted for the car, my legs burning as I sprinted across the clearing. The growling grew louder, the sound of something moving through the trees chasing after me. I could hear it getting closer, the pounding of its footsteps echoing in my ears. I reached the car, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it, the engine roaring to life. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I locked the doors and threw the car into reverse. The headlights illuminated the clearing, and for a brief moment, I saw it. The figure stood at the edge of the trees, its body hunched, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its eyes gleamed in the light, and its mouth, if it was a mouth, hung open, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I hit the gas, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I sped out of the clearing and back onto the road. My hands shook on the wheel, my heart racing as I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing after me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the darkness behind me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, hours later. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me, waiting for me to stop. I've never gone camping alone since that night, and I never will again. The idea of spending a weekend in an isolated cabin seemed perfect at the time. I had been craving solitude, a break from the constant notifications and noise of my daily life. Work had been relentless, and I felt like I hadn't had a moment to breathe in weeks. So when I stumbled upon the listing for a remote cabin rental miles away from the nearest town, tucked deep in the woods, it felt like exactly what I needed. The photos of the cabin were idyllic, a small, rustic structure nestled among towering pines, a wood-burning fireplace, and a wraparound porch with views of the surrounding forest. The host, a man named Peter, assured me in the listing that the cabin was the ultimate getaway for anyone seeking peace and quiet. That's exactly what I was after. The drive out to the cabin took longer than expected. The directions from Peter had been straightforward enough, but as I wound deeper into the woods, the road narrowed turning into a dirt path that was barely wide enough for my car. My GPS signal cut out about an hour before I arrived, leaving me to rely solely on the hand-drawn map Peter had provided. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp and cool, and the silence was immediate, no distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. I parked the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath. The cabin looked even better in person, small and cozy, with a warm glow coming from the windows. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and headed inside. The interior of the cabin was exactly as advertised, rustic and charming, with a stone fireplace in the living room, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom in the back. The windows overlooked the dense forest, and the porch looked like the perfect place to sit and sip coffee in the morning. After unpacking, I made myself a quick dinner and settled in for the night. I lit a fire in the fireplace and curled up on the couch with a book, the crackling of the fire and the soft glow of the flames creating the perfect atmosphere for relaxation. By the time I headed to bed, I was feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. The bed was comfortable, and as I lay there, listening to the gentle rustling of the trees outside, I felt myself drifting off into a deep, peaceful sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to complete darkness. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The fire in the living room had long since died down, leaving the cabin cold and dark. I sat up in bed, blinking into the darkness, trying to shake off the disorientation of being jolted awake. Then I heard a faint noise, like the creak of floorboards coming from the living room. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained to listen. The cabin was silent now, the only sound the soft whisper of wind against the windows. I told myself it was nothing, just the old cabin settling, or maybe a branch brushing against the roof. But the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach wouldn't go away. I reached for my phone, fumbling with it in the darkness. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow across the room, but there was no signal. I hadn't expected there to be. Peter had warned me that the cabin was too remote for cell service, but the lack of connection only made the cabin feel more isolated, more vulnerable. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I was overreacting. It was just an old cabin in the middle of the woods. I was alone. No one knew I was here. But that thought only made me feel worse. I got out of bed, slipping on my shoes and grabbing the flashlight I had packed, just in case. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I stepped into the hallway, making my way toward the living room. The cabin was quiet, the floor creaking softly under my feet as I walked. The fire had completely died out, leaving the room cold and still. I shone the flashlight around the room, my heart pounding in my chest. But everything looked as it should: the couch, the small table, the stack of firewood near the hearth. Nothing was out of place. I was just about to turn back to bed when I heard it again. A creak. Louder this time, definitely coming from inside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned, shining the flashlight toward the kitchen. The beam of light flickered as it swept across the small room, illuminating the old wooden cabinets and the worn countertops. Nothing. But then I saw it. The back door, the one that led out to the porch, was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I stared at the door, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I had locked it before going to bed. I was sure of it. I had checked all the doors before turning in for the night. But now the door was open, just a crack, as if someone had been inside. I took a step back, my mind racing. Someone was out there. Someone had been in the cabin while I was asleep. For a long moment, I just stood there, frozen, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I hadn't heard anyone, hadn't seen anything, but the door was open. The flashlight flickered again, and I fumbled with it, my hands trembling as I tried to steady the beam. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. Now. I backed away from the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way toward the front door. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, my mind racing with panic. I had to get out of here. I didn't know what was out there, but I couldn't stay. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard a low, creaking sound coming from the porch. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Someone was out there, on the porch. For a moment, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't go out there. Not with someone waiting on the other side. I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I needed to think. I needed to stay calm. But the cabin felt like it was closing in on me. The walls too close, the darkness too thick. I turned and ran back to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, turning it with trembling fingers. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I grabbed my phone again. No signal, of course. I paced the small room, my mind racing. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't leave. I was trapped. The cabin was silent now, but I knew that whatever or whoever was outside hadn't gone away. I could feel it. I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to get out of this. For what felt like hours, I just sat there listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. My mind raced with possibilities. Had it been an animal? A person? Was someone watching me? Or had I imagined the whole thing? Then, just as I was beginning to convince myself that it was all in my head, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the window. I turned, the flashlight beam flickering as I shone it toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could hear it clearly now tap, tap, tap like fingers gently tapping against the glass. My blood ran cold. Someone was outside the window. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I stared at the window, my mind screaming at me to run, to hide, to do something, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then the tapping stopped. Silence. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something to happen. The flashlight beam flickered again, casting long shadows across the room, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the doorknob twist. Inch by inch, the soft creak of the wood echoing through the room. I backed away, my mind racing with panic. The door was locked, but it wouldn't hold for long. Whoever was outside, they were trying to get in. I grabbed the chair from the corner of the room and jammed it under the doorknob, my hands shaking as I shoved it into place. The doorknob rattled again, more insistently this time, but the chair held. For now. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and grabbed my phone again, my fingers trembling as I stared at the screen. No signal. Still no signal. The rattling stopped. and for a long moment there was silence again. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard a voice. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but I could hear it clearly. Let me in. My blood turned to ice. The voice was faint, almost melodic, but there was something wrong about it, something unnatural. Let me in, the voice whispered again, this time more insistent. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice continued, whispering softly, repeating the same words over and over again. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice seemed to echo in my head, growing louder and louder with each repetition. Let me in. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the window, pulling the curtains aside and throwing it open. The cold night air hit me like a wave as I scrambled out, landing hard on the ground below. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The forest closed in around me, the trees towering overhead as I sprinted through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear the voice, faint now, carried on the wind. Let me in. I kept running, my legs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't look back at the cabin as I sped down the dirt road, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't care what was behind me. I just needed to get away. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. Hours later, I pulled into the first gas station I saw and parked under the bright lights, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I haven't been back to the cabin since.